What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Project 100,000. In the early years of Vietnam, Robert McNamara created Project 100,000 as a way to draft those who previously failed to meet military mental and medical standards. This included a lot of Americans with an IQ below 70. Majority of these men didn't have above a 9th grade education and were, in a sense, a lot like Forrest Gump and Gomer Pyle. Because of obvious learning disabilities and difficulty understanding, these morons were mostly given jobs on the front lines of the war. It was worded as a service project, and they were told it would help them gain skills needed to live a better life after the service. In reality, they were cannon fodder for the DOD, and died at a much higher rate than their non-disabled counterparts. These men largely couldn't read, wrote, or understand why they were in Vietnam or what they were there to do. They suffered more cases of post-traumatic stress, lower unemployment rates, and higher rates of divorce and suicide than non-NSM veterans. Very sad story of the government taking advantage of its own citizens. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. The Pentagon documents during the Vietnam War. I'd say they're more disgusting than terrifying, but a document leaked saying the war was unwinnable and the US was still present, only to prevent a humiliating defeat. If I remember correctly, the document leaked in 1969, and combat troops were in Vietnam till 1973, followed by South Vietnam's collapse in 1975. It's mostly terrifying because over 60,000 Americans were killed and an estimated 1 million Vietnamese, while halfway through the feds realized it was a lost cause but didn't stop. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. The most terrifying fact is that people still trust their government after all the emerging cases of untruthfulness, deceit and conspiracy. If they have lied that much in the past, what makes people think they aren't lying just as much now? In Stranger Things, the experiments on the development of psychic abilities were actually done during Cold War or something, and the patients were exposed to torture and treatments that ended up killing them. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. The Keiton Forest Massacre. After the joint invasion of Poland by Germany and the USSR, the Russians executed 22,000 Polish officers and buried their remains in mass graves in the Keiton Forest. Years later, some of the bodies were discovered. The Soviets decided to cover up the atrocity by claiming it was the Germans that did it, based on a German pistol found in the area. Many people had their doubts, but this was the Soviet Union. You couldn't just openly question the state. Just before the collapse, the truth was finally revealed. Not a clue if it were declassified. Terrifying. Maybe. Disgusting. Yes. Unit 731. Japanese testing on people. Rape. Kidnapping. Amputations and reattaching limbs to different parts without any anesthetic, to name some stuff they did.